if you have a renewable resource that you can turn on and off anytime you want, hey, bring on the PV, bring on the wind. Let's do more of that. So I feel we help them. I think we help. So I see this synergistic, and I think Geotest is the way to get, frankly, the hardest percent of your 100% renewable portfolio standard. To have a fully renewable grid, we do the hardest stuff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of CleanTech is the podcast. This is episode 44, and today we have a really interesting conversation discussing a new technology, or at least a newly proven technology, with John King, the CEO and founder of Hyperlight Energy. To summarize, Hyperlight Energy has created a concentrated solar power technology, or also known as CSP, which is basically concentrating the heat of solar energy using mirrors. That has basically allows them to create what NREL has deemed as the cheapest electricity. That is, basically the cheapest model to produce electricity. So that's again coming from NREL. So I think there's a lot of credit there. But on top of that, they've also, which I think is probably the more fascinating aspect of what they're doing here, is they've identified a way to store potentially, it sounds like, months worth of energy in certain rock formations in the earth. So it's really interesting, kind of like creating basically a giant heat battery using certain rock in the earth, which can be really incredible given some of the technologies they have. So really very interesting conversation with John today. We talked a lot about the space at large and kind of his thoughts on the future of it, some of the regulatory issues, different topics around kind of the entrepreneurship models and venture capital models within ClimateTech, kind of post-CleanTech 1.0. But very, very interesting conversation in general. Really excited to be able to share this with you. Of course, before we do get into the show, we want to make big thanks to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the ClimateTech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing, perhaps entering a new market, or have just got funding and looking to expand, or maybe you potentially are looking to make a career change, you can reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com, or you can reach one of their consultants directly by finding the appropriate person through their LinkedIn page. So again, big shout out to NextWave for making this possible. And without further ado, let's get into the show.
All right. Welcome to the show, John. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm very glad to have you. I think this is going to be one of those very new conversations, right? These are my favorite. These ones where I'm learning completely everything from scratch. So why don't you, I guess, just start us off by giving a quick introduction to yourself and what you're doing currently?
Sure. So I'm John King. I'm co-founder and CEO of Hyperlight Energy. And we've been at this over a decade. And we actually originally started trying to develop algae to biofuels, photobioreactors. So we had these plastic tubes, and solving some of the technical challenges in that, we realized we could actually, when we were trying to bounce unwanted infrared light off the system, we realized we could actually not only bounce photons, but aim the photons. And so we replaced the stuff we were bouncing the IR. We started bouncing off the whole visible and infrared spectrum, and we realized we had a solar concentrator. So we had developed by accident a plastic-based structure for a solar concentrator. So we had accidentally invented the world's lowest cost solar concentrator. So we pivoted away from algae and have raised through government grants and contracts several $1 million to develop it through multiple generations. And we are going to market with a disruptively low-cost solar concentrator. And so that's the background. And you might have some questions about, concentrated solar power. Is that, the same or different than PV? And what are you guys doing, et cetera? But I'll pause there and let you ask questions as you may.
Yeah, so I've got a couple, I guess. Maybe first of all, I'd be keen to understand what ended up getting you interested in the space at the first place, right? What was the impetus there?
Yeah, I love talking about that. So I actually I'm an engineer by training, Caltech undergrad, and was in the medical device space I have a bunch of patents from that and trying to, help people and do good work. And I was driving around in my biodiesel powered Dodge Ram because I'm also, I'm a, environmentally concerned person, and I had 100% biodiesel in the tank. So some of which I made myself, and I thought to myself, why doesn't everybody do this? Not a drop of polluting foreign oil in the tank. Like, what's not to love? And so then looked at, well, there's not enough soybeans to make the biodiesel. Like, even if we planted the whole country. And so that I studied a little bit more on my own and looked at algae as a feedstock. And you could, in theory, there is enough land to do that. And so I started growing algae in my kitchen, and then went to the garage and into the backyard, and went all in on that. And I pivoted out of CleanTech and all that, and just really went hard on that, and realized algae is really hard. It remains an R&D field to this day, but over 10 years ago, we pivoted over to CSP and have really run with that.
Interesting. So maybe then the next thing I'd be curious, could you just maybe break down for non-technical people, myself included, when you talk about bouncing and aiming photons, can you talk about the process maybe in like a very simplified way?
Absolutely. So it really gets back to the difference between what you're using to try to collect the sunlight. You need a surface area, right? You need something to catch the sunlight. And most people think of PV panels like these black rectangles that are on your roof. Those have silicon semiconductor technology that's directly converting the sunlight into electricity. If you use a mirror, it's cheaper than the semiconductor technology. And it uses the whole spectrum of sunlight, both the visible and the heat. PV panels don't use that. So if you use a mirror, you can bounce. So you just reflect the light and you hit a target. And it's just like a kid using a magnifying glass to burn a hole in a leaf. When you concentrate the sunlight, is very powerful. And the thing you do at the target, you convert it. It's heat energy. That's the key thing. It's heat energy. It's not electricity. It goes to heat energy. And then you have to do something with that. And that's the trick. What do you do with it? So that is one of the key things that's held up concentrated solar power, CSP, is that we can do that piece of it cheaper than PV, but then what do you do with the heat? You got to build a power plant and run a steam turbine. So you make steam, you run a steam turbine to generate electricity. And that's been the Achilles heel of CSP for a long time. So that's really limited deployment. We have followed a commercialization path where we're looking for large industrial customers that actually can just use the heat. So we don't have to start out building a power plant. Now we've come full circle, and we'll talk about Geotest and everything else. I'm looking forward to that, and how we are going to generate an enormous amount of power and do some amazing things. But the front end, the early stages of deployment, it's just we go to customers that need the heat.
Yeah, so could you maybe talk about that? I'd be keen to understand maybe just the rough stages you're planning, if you could talk about that, and then maybe kind of on a macro, what are you doing now? You've explained the individual technology and how it works in a micro level. Can you talk about the macro?
Absolutely, I love it. So throughout the world, and in particular, just really coincidentally, in particular in California now, there is a kind of oil production called heavy oil, where they now here today, as we live and breathe, as we sit and talk, they're burning natural gas to make steam that goes downhole. And it's this heavy oil, high viscosity, that you can't get out any other way. It's just like where you have maple syrup in the microwave, you heat it up and it runs like water. So they're literally heating up this oil with the steam, and it runs to the production wells and they bring it up. So there's a large amount of that going on. It's maybe, it's low single-digit % of the overall picture globally, but it's still a big amount, right? So what we are doing, and there's a couple other companies that I think went with higher cost platforms, but they proved you could do this technically, that you make the solar steam and then you send the solar steam downhole and you're instantaneously decarbonizing a big chunk of the oil production infrastructure that's happening now today. And so it's happening now in the US. And, there's in particular with current events and disruptions due to war and other things, I think people are talking about, hey, we need more oil now. Elon Musk and Jennifer Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, have said, we need more oil. And it's not because those two people don't believe in energy transition, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not saying, oh yeah, forget energy transition. They're saying right here now, we need more of what we've been doing. And I agree. And I actually would add, and we have been trying to decarbonize what we're doing now so that we can keep it going and lower the carbon intensity. So that's a big push for what we're doing now. So the big picture right now in the immediate term is to do solar enhanced oil recovery so that we're decarbonizing the stuff we do need now. But there's a bigger picture, more exciting stuff, but that's initially, and I want to pause there to give you a chance to get your head around that stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a quite interesting topic that a lot of people don't want to discuss because the goal is, the energy transition, but I think there's also something to be said about using technology and maybe fixing some of the existing aspects to have things like energy independence, right? And having that sovereignty as a country, for example, right? And maybe the US perhaps is one of the more capable of developing these technologies, yet maybe the one of the least in need of it per se, right? But I think that there's so many countries that could really be benefiting from some of this technology right now. So I think that's just an interesting comment to make. One thing I would be keen to understand is when you talk about, since you're focused on the heat aspect, where can you deploy these? Because I'm from the Midwest and it's very cold there in the winter. So I'm sure there's plenty of applications where you could use that heat there. What are the requirements in order to actually have this deployable?
Good question. So any solar technology the hardware costs what it costs. And so you want the most sunlight possible to, monetize that equipment cost, to profit from the equipment. But when you have a lower cost platform, lower cost hardware, that grows the circle, right? It grows the circle of applicable locations. And so I don't know yet how far we go out. I don't think we're going to be deploying in like the Arctic Circle anytime soon, but I think the latitudes where there's enough sun, we definitely go further north than I think any other CSP platform. I can't say for sure that we could go in the Midwest right here now today, just because I've been so focused on the enhanced oil recovery where it is, and I don't know of any enhanced oil recovery in the Midwest at this time. But we absolutely, and I want to actually talk about Geotest. We want to go big with that. We want to go global with that. So definitely deploying it in large chunks of the country for sure.
Yeah, why don't we, before we get into Geotest, I think this would be a good segue, is could you talk about, generally speaking, I want a rough overview of the history of this technology and kind of where we are now and where you think it's going, creating this new kind of
sure
sub-segment, if you will.
Sure. Well, I think it's not going to be just a subsegment. I think it's going to be a category killer. But you want I misunderstood, history of Hyperlight's Hilux platform, or a history of kind of Geotest?
Of Geotest and kind of how
Sure.
I guess mainly focused maybe on the CSP aspect.
Sure. So Geotest is a lot like geothermal. Geothermal energy is just going to where you have geological formations that have the right characteristics. They have the right porosity to have fluids moving through, and they have, importantly, are close to hot rock already, to magma, I guess. Typically, you're close enough so that when you pull up these hot fluids, you make power with a steam turbine or what's called an organic Rankine cycle turbine at the surface, and then you re-inject the fluid actually to go back into contact with that hot rock to pull up more heat. And it's a continuous flow process. So The nice thing about that is that it's 24/7. It's always there because the rock's always hot, no matter if it's cold outside or sunny or cloudy or whatever, night, winter, don't care. So that's geothermal. The downside is that with current technology, you can only go in limited locations where the rock's already hot. And the way they operate these well systems, there's absolutely no flexibility. It has to be on all the time. It's actually extremely technically difficult and expensive to turn it off. So those are the two drawbacks to geothermal. I'm a fan of geothermal. I'm just being kind of honest about pros and cons. Pros is it's renewable energy, so that's awesome, and it's not intermittent. So those are two strong pros. So CSP. What's interesting about CSP is that you're generating temperatures with the sun, and you can go down hole with the heat. You don't need to store the heat above ground. You don't need to make power and transfer the power. You can just go down hole with the heat. And pretty much throughout the whole country, there are these sedimentary formations where if you're injecting the steam, you can create a geothermal resource, a synthetic geothermal resource. And the history of this, it's stunning. I've been doing this business development, trying to do these enhanced oil recovery projects. We do have one signed very recently, our first one. And I was literally at a well site and I'm saying, look, all this solar heat we're going to put down hole. Hey, man, I went to Caltech. I know energy is neither created nor destroyed. The energy produced is oil from these EOR sites. It's not, the thermal energy isn't changing forms into some other form of energy. It's not disappearing. Where does this go? It stays down there until you bring it back up. So the production at these EOR sites, it's actually like 95% water and only 5% oil. And that 95% water is hot. It's you have at these EOR sites, you have a geothermal resource that you created when you put the steam down. And so I was sitting there and I said, okay, let's look at doing a power cycle and making power out of it. And that's really and so with the EOR, it's been happening in California for 60 years. In fact, it was first invented. California's an innovator across the energy sector. We first did thermal enhanced oil. The world's first deployment was here in California. And they were steaming these formations and all this oil is coming up. Let's keep doing it. So they've been doing it 60 years. And you look at the technology space where they talk about round trip efficiency of energy storage. And, we piloted it for a year. We piloted it for 6 months. Well, geological thermal energy storage has been in operation for 60 years in the oil patch. So and they've looked at it because oil companies want to make money. And so they don't want to be wasting money, putting too much heat down that they don't need to put. So they've looked at the round trip efficiency of doing this already. And they have 60 years of data. I've seen these reports. There's like these multi-100-page reports about the round trip thermal efficiency of doing this. And it's extremely high. You get, for a big field, you don't want to do a big field. A small field, most of the heat is going to leak out the sides. But for a big field, that's not, that phenomenon is muted significantly. And so you're looking at 70, 80, 90% round trip thermal efficiency for the heat going in and out. And this is just measured data over 6 decades. So that also stands apart from the emerging technologies in storage. It stays down there 6 months, 12 months. Like they start steaming these formations. They can turn it off and come back 6 months later and it's still hot. It was just stunning to me. Imagine, 6 months of stored energy. And like if you did that at your house, say your solar panels, you would have to have 180 Tesla Powerwalls back in your backyard so that you have 180 days worth of solar energy, right? Right, exactly. That's what this is. That's what Geotest is. The rock's already there. And in fact, if you do it at the oil recovery site, the enhanced oil recovery sites, the wells are already there. So that's the exciting thing. So that's the push now. That's the future. That's the background, is that we're combining CSP, concentrated solar power, the solar heat. We're combining that with geothermal technology so that we have a synthetically created geothermal resource. And we're retrofitting at the EOR sites, so we don't have to drill new wells. We don't have to have new steam lines and everything at the surface. So we're leveraging existing knowledge and existing infrastructure.
Okay. So when you guys are able to go beyond just this heat aspect and kind of pair with a turbine, could you talk about that, the deployment? You talk about it being everywhere. Let's talk about the big picture here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love talking about that. So we're also using existing turbine technology. The temperatures are lower than a natural gas power plant. So we would use a combination of a steam turbine and then an organic Rankine cycle turbine, which uses a lower boiling point fluid instead of water. So it operates right around boiling, actually. And so we would use a combination of those two kinds of turbines, and the heat comes up. We would, our unique thing is that we actually store a little bit of the CSP solar, high quality solar heat at the surface, just a little bit, so that we can superheat what comes up and increase the efficiency on the turbines. That's our little secret sauce, okay? You don't have to do that, but we feel that that's the best way to do it. So the awesome thing here, because the sites are set up, these wells are push-pull. You can go in or out of these wells. So it doesn't have that has to operate 24/7 requirement that traditional geothermal is. So once you have those power gen, the power cycle set up at the surface, you turn the wells, when the grid operator says we need power now, it's dark, it's cloudy, it's winter, whatever, turn on. We say, okay, turn the pumps on, everything's going, and we're producing power. And we just go as long as they want, because the thing's got 6 months of energy stored in it. We can literally run until they tell us to turn off. They say, okay, it's sunny and windy, we don't need you anymore, turn off, and we turn off. And since it's sunny, right, everybody else wants to be producing power because it's sunny, we got to sell it now. We're like, nah, peace, we don't care. We'll store that down hole. We got our wells ready to go. We're going to bank it for when you need us again.
So it's the ultimate energy arbitrage.
You got it. You got it, man. Yeah. So, and using the existing infrastructure out there. And the cool thing is that here's the other, I mean, I feel like an infomercial, but wait, there's more. So I've been looking at this, and there's been a program in California since it was in the 80s and 90s where you got paid to build a natural gas power plant in the oil field. The waste heat from the power plants generates the steam that they use to do the EOR. So it's two uses of the heat. Now, okay, since the 80s and 90s, the amount of oil down there has been in just the wells dry up. So there's less of it. So there's less steam demand for the EOR. So these cogen plants, there's a lot of them are idle now. So you got like about approximately 2 gigawatts of these cogen plants out there that are largely idle, that are already hooked up to the grid, that already have the grid impact studies, and you could just repower them with Geotest. You have to modify the turbine, the generator technology, but everything else is the same, right? So in terms of the timeline to deployment, it's very different than any other type of technology to connect to the grid, and certainly at the scale.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Just in the last episode, we talked about the interconnection process. So I was going to ask about that, because you're going to be likely repowering a lot of things. Could you maybe just talk, for anybody who's not familiar and who maybe didn't listen last time, what does the difference look like for this versus, say, let's just say even a solar farm?
Right. So the grid is a very sophisticated network that is actively managed and needs to work 24/7, 365. So to be able to put power on the grid, you need to do what's called the grid impact study. And this is anywhere. You can't just say, oh yeah, here, there's a wire, let's just connect to it and put some power on. No, you can destabilize things. You can hurt people. You can do all sorts of things. cause blackouts, whatever. So the grid impact study by itself takes like a year, and it's very expensive. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And so for us, again, those grid impact studies were done in the 80s and 90s. So these cogen plants are already part of the mix. That's just the study. Then there's obviously, you got to build a substation, you got to build, there's transformers, there's all sorts of grid interconnect infrastructure. And you got to have your wire that connects to the transmission system. So that stuff also that's time and money, engineering and design, all of that. Once you get the grid impact study done, then you start on the design and implementation of actually connecting to the grid. So I don't know, another 6 months to a year. So by the time, you're from when you get the idea to when you're actually when you have the ability to put power on the grid, I think legit, it's like 2 years for a big project.
I think from what I'm hearing in some areas, I think CAISO especially right now, it might even be a bit longer than that. So I think that the actual magnitude is a little bit even.
I'm an optimist.
Yeah,
I'm an optimist.
Yeah, we'll see what FERC does in the future, right? Hopefully
Right.
they improve some things, but I guess I'm trying to think maybe just to help people visualize, could you give us like a quick version of like, what does this look like if they're driving and these things are all over the place in 20 years, 10 years, what are they going to look like when they see them? Like, is it going to affect their views?
Oh, it's interesting. The oil patch in California is in San Joaquin Valley. So that's ag country. And most people that know California know the 5 freeway and the 99 freeway go through on the 2 sides of the valley. And you drive through a lot of pasture, a lot of feedlots, dairies, and a lot of cropland. You will occasionally from the road catch sight of oil wells. You can see some of the oil patch from the various freeways. To do this specific application, we're looking at going in adjacent to the oil fields, in and among the wells, and then on the barren land, the available land next to the oil wells. And so what those look like, it's a field of mirrors. It's a field of mirrors. It looks shiny and cool. We are not a tower technology. We are a line focused technology. So we don't go 50 or 100 feet in the air or 200 feet in the air and have this thing that's super duper bright. We have a black pipe that's 25 feet in the air and it's really super long. So picture big long strips. And those things light up. They're only 25 feet in the air. And the shininess of them points down because we're reflecting the light up. And there's a shroud at the top that we catch all the light, right? Mm-hmm. So if you saw it from the road, you would see these long pipe looking things on the top of these 25-foot poles. And if you were able to, you would see at ground level, you'd see a ton of mirrors.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I always love to hear how this stuff's how it's going to look because I'm a very visual person, so I appreciate that. I guess one of the big things that's coming to mind here is if this technology, because this is so efficient and is really quite deployable, what do you see as the future? As obviously there's a humongous push for solar and wind and storage. Do you see that stuff essentially becoming to some extent, I don't know, old hat, and then this being kind of the major new technology that's being put in?
I do believe that CSP is poised for a new dawn, if you'll pardon the pun, because because if the future is storage, and I think everybody's talking about the need for energy storage to address the intermittency. If the future is storage, I do think because we didn't talk about this, there's the amount of rock that can do this under California alone is 6 cubic miles. You've got cubic miles of this stuff under Texas that's already got wells in place, right? I mean, there's a lot of rock. So if the future is storage, then the future is thermal and the future is geological. Now, that's not competitive with PV and wind. That's complementary. The more dispatchable renewable you have available, the easier it is to justify putting the intermittent stuff on the grid, right? If you have a renewable resource that you can turn on and off anytime you want, hey, bring on the PV, bring on the wind. Let's do more of that. So I feel we help them. I think we help. So I see this synergistic, and I think Geotest is the way to get, frankly, the hardest percent of your 100% renewable portfolio standard. To have a fully renewable grid, we do the hardest stuff to decarbonize, which lets everybody else do the easy stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's always interesting to consider the timing of technologies, right? I think you talk about if you have a 4-lane highway and you've got all the cars go 35 miles an hour, you introduce something better, it's going to be blocked up by the rest of the traffic, right? And I'm always curious to see how these things play out together. I guess maybe do you have comments on that? Kind of, maybe we could talk about if this Geotest kind of technology is really going to be a huge category on its own. It sounds like you're likely one of the first people in this. So what are your thoughts about being in the early stages, kind of like the Tesla of Geotest, right?
Yeah.
And what do you think about, because of the necessity for this, what do you think about the idea of patenting versus making things open source? I just want to kind of open up the can here.
Absolutely. And I love that phrase. I do. We are one of the first ones to be talking about this, and we're certainly the first one to announce a project. We did announce a project just I don't know, a few weeks ago. It's a heat purchase agreement for our technology, Hilux, at a small independent oil producer outside Bakersfield in the oil patch in California, and it includes a pilot of our platform, Tectonic Sun. So for sure, nobody's heard of Geotest. Nobody knows what this is. So I relish the role of being an evangelist for the category. So absolutely, I aspire to be like your Elon Musk or your Steve Jobs, right? I aspire, they didn't invent EVs, they didn't invent smartphones, but they were popularizing, and EVs went big after Tesla. Smartphones went big after the iPhone, right? So I of course, any guy in my position wants to be that for Geotest. So we certainly want to be, as Tesla is to EVs, we certainly want Hyperlight to be to Geotest for sure. And we see, so our platform is Tectonic Sun, and our first deployment there in Bakersfield is Tectonic Sun Alpha. And for sure, Tectonic Sun Alpha is our version of the Tesla Roadster, without a doubt. That's our view. Patents versus open source. I'm knocking on wood. We're working on another announcement, actually, where we can't talk about it right now. Maybe in another few weeks, we're working on another big thing, and that's going to be not our IP. We're helping advance a thing that's not our IP. So I'm okay just saying, let's just do this. And if I'm just promoting somebody else's gizmo, I'm fine with that. Tectonic Sun, like I said, we have that secret sauce where we hold a little bit of heat at the surface to superheat and make the power cycle more efficient. We feel that's better, but that's not necessary. And so there are other people that, for example, there was 4 projects at the DOE that the DOE just announced at looking at repurposing old oil wells for accessing the heat that's actually there from the hot rock. There are some oil wells where they're just close to some hot rock incidentally, right? And so the idea of repurposing the oil wells to do geothermal is out there, independent of us. And so those approaches actually have some solutions to the problems that we feel Tectonic Sun addresses. They've got kind of a different basket of solutions that, well, they might choose somebody else's solar platform and use their own solution to the Geotest problems, and they're going to go and do their own thing. That could happen. And here I am, I'm promoting the category and saying we should all do this, let's do it. And I want to change the world, man. I've been doing this for a long time. I want to see energy transition. I feel we're competitive. I feel we're fine. I feel it's going to be a huge market. I feel we'll find our place in it. But if look, Tesla's not, Elon Musk said, succeed or fail, they wanted to grow EVs, and they absolutely have.
Absolutely.
And I mean, there's so many smartphones on the market. Apple's certainly the most profitable, but there's a lot of other smartphones out there. I mean, there's another big one, obviously Samsung. So there's going to be the other competitors in the space. Okay, let's do it. Let's transition. Let's all work together to transition and make it happen.
Yeah, very interesting. I always think it's fascinating talking about this when it's more in a commercial technology, right? It's not necessarily direct to consumer. I'm
Right.
a big fan of Steve Jobs. If you can see in the back, I've got his book up there. No, I think it's fascinating to talk about this, and it's always an interesting thing because it seems as though the way the world is going, there's almost this kind of push for a redistribution of profits to make it more equitable for generally speaking everybody, right? And if we're truly trying to save the planet, it means we're all in the same boat, right? If that's actually the issue that we're facing, no one of us can get away from it, right? No matter how much money we have. So I think it's very interesting to talk about that. Thanks for indulging. I think what was I going to say next? I'd be keen to understand the financial side of things, from what it was like to go and get funding. How did they start? Because obviously R&D funding, I think, is extremely low, I think, generally speaking. That's my personal opinion. So can you talk us through the process from the early days up to now? And then after that, I want to go into the financing of these projects.
Yeah. How much time do you have? So I've got a very colorful story there that I hope your listeners will find entertaining. We didn't talk about this in our initial conversations before the podcast to get to know each other here. So this you might get a kick out of this part. So I told you about the background about the algae and pivoting over and saying, oh, we're gonna do this. Okay, so you're talking to the one guy probably in the world that did a technology-based startup venture as a worker-owned cooperative. Not an LLC, not a C Corp. The form of business that we started with was a worker-owned co-op. Like, have you even heard what a worker-owned cooperative is? So there's right. You're shaking your head on the video here. Nobody has. And let me tell you, when you're talking across the table from a venture capitalist, and they say, King, we like what you're doing technically, but cooperative? I can assure you the conversation's over at that point. There may be mouths moving, there may be words coming out, but there is no conversation happening after that point. So you can imagine how that went. We never raised a single dollar of VC. I had friends and family money to get it launched. And then honestly, we had to get the contracts and grants from the California Energy Commission, the Department of Energy. Southern California Gas Company has an R&D program. And so we got the programmatic money, not the VC money, to develop the technology. Before long, it became super clear that we were going to have to transition our form of business. So we did have to transition away from being a cooperative to just have a prayer of continuing, which we did. So we are now a C Corp. But the heart of a social innovator still beats in my chest. So right now, the watchword is diversity and inclusion, social equity, all of that. And so we've got plans in place to advance those similar goals and those parallel goals. It lives again. The kind of people that want to address climate change are also the types of people that also want to address any kind of social inequity. So we're going to do everything we can to be consistent with the DOE and the CEC are saying, look, you got to include your diversity and inclusion plans in your proposal. So I'm like, okay, we're there. The last piece of that for the cooperative thing. I mean, I was a true believer. There's this, you can look up Mondragon, M-O-N Dragon. Mondragon in Spain is a very large, successful industrial co-op. They weren't a tech startup to start. They started in the 50s. They started making ovens or stoves. And they're now like a 45,000 person company. They're like a mini GE over in Europe. It's
Mhm.
huge. And it's a worker on co-op. So I went over there, I took executive training, and I was like, I'm gonna do this in the US. So it didn't work. But what was interesting was, if you remember CleanTech crash 1.0, like 2008, 9, 10, where just the bottom fell out. What's interesting, if we had successfully raised the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that our competitors had at that point, we would have been under immense pressure from the VCs to go to mega scale immediately before the tech was ready.
Mm-hmm.
We had to just focus on the tech dev. We couldn't do the mega projects. And this is the other thing we didn't talk about earlier. CSP, they don't just have to build a power plant, and that's an economic challenge. CSP has a second huge challenge. If you're not us, if you have a metal-based system, not plastic, if you have a metal-based structure to hold up your mirrors, your main way of cost reduction is going scale, big scale. You get your economies of scale to get your costs down. Okay, that's why you're driven to these mega projects immediately, because you got to chase cost. Okay, well, wait a second. When you step, and companies literally did this. We have a demo that's 500 kilowatts. Our current project we're doing is 1.5, and we just signed one for 5. So you can see that scale up, 1/2 to 1.5 to 5. Okay. There were companies that had 500 kilowatts. Their very next project was 500 megawatts, 1000x scale. Okay. When you have problems that happen on your deployment, you're not just fixing it at the next step up, you're fixing it at 1000x scale. The kind of poster child problem is, there was a project, I want to say Crescent Dunes. It was Solar Reserve. I have friends who were there and who told me about this, where they had, this is a power tower technology, and they had hired Cobra ACS or whatever, Cobra from Spain, that had built a couple of power towers in Spain. For the feed-in tariff, there was like 27 cents a kilowatt hour. So they had all this money to work with, and they were fine going do these towers. So they used this experienced EPC firm to build it. Well, the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain, right? But it never freezes. Yeah, but it never freezes. You go to Crescent Dunes, it's a high desert in Nevada. Oh, it freezes. They've got this thing called winter there. And so the actuators that move these mirrors track the sun. Got whatever, 10,000 mirrors, garage door size mirrors out there. Water penetration, because they're not waterproof, because you don't need that in Spain. Water penetration freezes, ice expands, breaks these things. So now you take 10,000 garage door size mirrors and turn them into 10,000 garage door size paperweights. Your project's not generating because it doesn't work. So you got no money. And all of a sudden now, do you even believe the supplier when they say, yeah, we'll give you 10,000 new actuators? Do you even believe them that they're going to work? Okay, do you go to another supplier? Do those actuators speak the same language as a control system you spent $10 million designing and implementing? Do you have to spend another $10 million to change your control system, to talk to the new actuators? And oh, by the way, the work crew that built the thing this is in the middle of nowhere. They already went home. They've been home for half a year. You're going to remobilize and bring your whole work crew back to put all this stuff out there. And oh, by the way, you got no money. So that's another challenge. For us, we like going incrementally scaling up. And so we didn't have that failing at scale. Our failures were never too big to fix. We failed plenty. I'm the world champion failure artist, whatever. I've failed so many times and stuff, but I've never failed too big to fix. And I'm not embarrassed to fail. I'm embarrassed if I'm not the first one to identify the failure and lead the charge to fix it. I'm going to spend 0 seconds trying to say, oh, this failure was really a success. No, it was a failure, and then you're going to fix it. And we always had that at small scale along the way, so we could afford the shoestring budgets we had to work with.
I think this is interesting. It kind of ties into this. You mentioned if you had all that VC funding behind you in CleanTech 1.0, probably wouldn't be where we are now with tech. But I think it's fascinating that they broke their own rule, which is in tech, obviously, in just pure tech. It's all about go fast and break things, right? Break and fix, break and fix, break and fix.
Yep.
And that's the complete opposite. They push everybody to these mass scales, right? And that's something I think about a lot with the hard tech side of ClimateTech and CleanTech, right? There is so much hard tech that needs to be created because everything in the world has to be redone in a sustainable manner. So I guess, do you have any comments on the VC world and kind of I don't know, some people might be upset at me saying this, but I feel sometimes that VCs, and when VCs get into companies, because of the nature of their business, where they have to go fast, they have to go big, some will break and many will break and fail, but they're just, because of that, they're a bit greedy. And as a result, the founders, I've talked to several of my mentors that did VC funding for their first startups, and they completely regret it because they could have sold 3 years in and made the same amount that they did when they were 4 times as large 10 years later, right? So I'm just kind of curious if you have any thoughts on that before we move on to the financing model.
Sure. Some of my best friends are VCs, so I can't throw those guys under the bus. I would never say never. I mean, we haven't taken VC to date, but I believe we're going to be doing that for both equity investment in the company and for project finance. I mean, there's hybrid models that, there's firms that are doing both those. And yeah, I mean, you have to be careful. I mean, I think you want to work with where there's a good fit. The firm has to have a good cultural fit. You have to have alignment on what you want to do. And that's part of why I'm so vocal about scaling up rationally. And I'm very vocal about that. So the VCs know, oh, if we work with King, he's going to be doing it this way. And okay, I don't want to go to mega scale overnight. I want to scale up rationally. I do want to go to mega scale. Okay, but not overnight. And I believe there's a lot of VCs that are going to like doing it that way and be okay doing it that way. And I think I have a good story to do it that way. So I think the VCs have also learned a lot from CleanTech 1.0, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of maturity that's coming along.
Yeah, for us, I can't speak to other companies. What I will say, actually, the SPACs. Have you looked at the SPACs? I hope
there's all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, the valuations some companies are getting, it's like, oh my gosh, how are you going to sustain that for like the 1 or 2 or 3 years before you get to market? What the heck story are you going to tell? I mean, like, holy crap, that's scary. That scares me. So I'm okay with like a sub-$1 billion valuation for a while. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, those are my comments. I mean, I think the VCs play an important role, and sure, it's just like, your startups, you got to pick a good startup. Well, the startup's got to pick a good VC.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's becoming more and more evident that way these days. But okay, let's move on to when deploying these technologies, and maybe some of it's not exactly kind of squared away yet, but what do you guys anticipate for kind of the time horizon to be able to, get the investment back? Perhaps we could talk about the methodology, right? Obviously you guys are going to be an energy developer, it sounds like, not necessarily a third-party service. So could you just kind of talk about that model?
Sure. So it's both equity finance for the company and then project finance for the projects. I think for the foreseeable future, we're going to follow the same playbook that solar PV did, which is PPAs. So we're going to call them HPAs, heat purchase agreements. So that's what we have for Tectonics and Alpha. And so I have an off-taker, a creditworthy off-taker with an operating project that has revenue, so they can afford to sign it. And so the funding source knows that the customer is going to pay. So now you go to the project finance providers. And for an emerging tech, your project return on investment needs to be higher than, BP a year ago or so said something like they were okay for photovoltaic projects doing 6 to 8% returns, just because that's a completely de-risked technology, right? For emerging tech, you got to be well above that, right? And you got to throw in some various kickers to make it really sweet. So we're going to be definitely double-digit rates of return for the project finance. I don't want to get into too specifics on
Yeah, that makes sense.
But healthy returns for the project finance providers. I think the other thing we want to do is co-own some of our projects. So we'll probably use some of our equity investment to co-own some of that equity in the projects we build. But that's kind of what does your capital stack look like? How your debt to equity ratio, all that stuff. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So maybe, I guess there's kind of two topics I want to go through still. I think we've got enough time to go through them quickly. What do you think is going to be kind of the role of regulation here? And I know there's always this history of past regulation being applied to new technology. So can you just kind of talk about this?
Yeah, since we are starting to run down on time, I'll tell you right now, the biggest hurdle is going to be the fact that we want to retrofit the enhanced oil recovery sites. And so the biggest question I get is, John, aren't you helping the oil industry? And so I have to say, I'm helping the oil industry decarbonize. And so I don't change the amount of oil in the ground. And what I'm doing is decarbonizing the way they're getting it out now. And if you look at a Geotest project, you're putting in massive solar infrastructure. And yes, the oil is still coming, but that's drying up. And over time, as that dries up, it's naturally, natively, organically, symbiotically transitioning year on year into a fully renewable asset. It's the very definition of energy transition, smooth energy transition. So that at the end, at that point in time where just there's like you got a less than 1% cut of oil, it doesn't even pay to separate it. I don't know, do you re-inject it? I mean, it's like waste oil at that point. It doesn't even pay to refine it. So at that point, you're fully renewable. And the other thing is, you say, John, isn't the point of renewables to keep oil in the ground? You're still getting oil out, even during that transition. I'm saying, well, yes, at the thermal operations, but remember, it's like 95, 96% is conventional. It's not thermal. So there's 95% of the wells were never, why would you do this at a conventional well in wherever? You wouldn't necessarily do that. So I do believe there's a pathway to decarbonize, but that's going to be the biggest regulatory thing, is that in particular in California, oil is a 4-letter word, and they just want to ban it, basically ban EOR. And so I'm kind of the oddball in the room, the CleanTech guy saying, no, don't ban it. I want to transition it. Give me a chance to transition these guys, decarbonize it on the front end, and then generate these gigantic solar batteries that'll power the grid. That's a big part of why I'm evangelizing this and spending a lot of my time and effort talking about the overall picture and opportunity. And yeah, the work I'm doing now to spread that word isn't going to entirely benefit me alone. I think it's going to benefit the industry as a whole, but I think it's also going to benefit my kids and grandkids and everybody's kids and grandkids.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. I really do think I'm going through Ray Dalio's book about the future of kind of governments and everything and how they fall. And something that really stood out to me was how nimble governments should be on kind of being able to change things. Not super nimble like a CleanTech startup, right? But nimble enough to adjust to the changing world, right? So I think that we'll see how this plays out in the future. I'm not sure. I'm not a policy expert.
I hope so. I hope you're right.
Yeah, let's see. Maybe, okay, so last topic here I want to go over. What are your thoughts on kind of the education space and how it's feeding ClimateTech and CleanTech people? I'm also curious to understand what type of engineers you need to work on this technology. So could you just talk about your thoughts generally on this?
Every kind of engineer. If we have success going forward, we're going to be staffing up significantly, and we're going to be wanting every kind of engineer. Interestingly, we're going to want a lot of the oil industry people, because these are wells. These are thermal well operations. So it overlaps highly. In fact, there's emerging geothermal technology companies that literally are founded by petroleum alumni. They're leaving the oil companies with the directional drilling, horizontal drilling, and fracking. All of that is applicable to enhanced geothermal systems, fully renewable. I counted no less than 4 new geothermal startups, and this is months old, there might be more by now, that are getting investment from VCs and So oil companies are saying, yeah, we like this. Let's do renewables with the oil and gas technology. So there's going to be a lot of transfer from oil and gas, frankly. And the thermal power systems, natural gas and coal plants, guess what? Those are thermal power plants. We're a thermal power plant. A lot of those people, we need them. And the workers in the field, the blue collar, like the operators out in the fields are going to be doing the same jobs, running these. So it's instead of an oil well, they're running a solar well. Okay. So people don't realize that. I think you're not just transitioning the energy supply, you're transitioning the job market for a lot of people. So I'm excited. I'm excited about it. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, I think that's honestly a very good point. Something I haven't brought up in a while is what you mentioned about transitioning the workforce, because I think I mentioned before the show where I come from, people always talk about how it's going to kill jobs, et cetera. And the truth of the matter is the upskilling it takes to run some of these things, even on the major changes, like when you're going to solar, for example, it's actually very, very minimal. It can be done. I think in this case, it's actually, I mean, it's going to be needed to have that past skill set to be able to go into this. So I think it aligns with the energy and talent transition.
To go just pitch myself a little and my company a little bit, not just category evangelism, but our factory is here in California, and about 80% of our platform is made in the USA. So that's different than, say, importing cheap Chinese silicon panels, right? So that's a big plus for this approach as well.
Yeah, I think it sounds like you guys are doing some very interesting things. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm super excited to see where this goes, and we'll probably have to have you on again in the hopefully not too distant future.
I love it. Yeah. You can see I'm knock on wood, don't want to jinx anything, but we have some exciting announcements coming out, and yeah, I'd love to talk about it some more. Yeah.
All right. Very good.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's episode with John. Really hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you're like anything like me and interested in these technologies, I'm hoping you were fascinated by what he had to say. So please do, if you're interested in continuing to hear about these conversations, subscribe and turn on notifications to be notified in the future of other similar episodes and similar discussions. And of course, as always, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, we do appreciate a review and a rating. Really, it does help bolster our exposure to the market. And of course, share this episode with somebody who might find it interesting. Maybe there's some people looking kind of to get into the energy space and are looking for something new and exciting. This could be an interesting topic for them to dive into. If you are interested, feel free to join our Slack channel to get engaged further with other professionals in the space. It's a good place to connect with other people who are kind of working within the ClimateTech sector. And then, of course, there's the newsletter you can subscribe to that comes out the 27th of every month, where we dive into one area or another in a bit more detail. And, of course, last but definitely not least, do connect with John on LinkedIn and learn more about Hyperlight Energy by going to their website. A quick preview for our next episode: we will be discussing IoT kind of at large with Priya Vijayakumar, who is the co-founder and CEO of Watt IQ, an IoT company specifically focused on reducing climate impact through helping to identify energy waste. And also, I think what was really fascinating was the ability to work with manufacturers to create better appliances or equipment in general that could last longer, kind of going into this sustainable mindset of how we produce and use things. So really interesting conversation with Priya coming up in the next episode. Please do tune in for that. But until then, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast, and we will see you next time.